March 23, 1945, Gelderland Province, Northern Netherlands. Captain James Hartley of the British 30 Assault Unit crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his breath forming small clouds in the cold pre-dawn air. Through his binoculars, he studied the concrete structure roughly 300 meters distant. The massive launch pad sat in unnatural silence, its surface appearing weathered by months of use. Beside him, Lieutenant David Morrison traced a gloved finger across their aerial reconnaissance photographs, comparing the images to the reality before them. "That's V2 infrastructure," Morrison whispered, his Scottish accent barely audible. "Same construction signature as the Peenemünde complex. Look at the blast deflector arrangement, textbook German engineering." Hartley nodded but said nothing. Something about the installation troubled him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Since September 1944, V2 rockets had been falling on London and Antwerp with terrifying regularity. Over 1,400 had struck England, killing 2,754 civilians and injuring more than 6,500. Each launch site they could identify and neutralize translated directly into British lives saved. The mathematics were brutally simple. But this site felt wrong. "Notice anything unusual?" Hartley asked quietly. Morrison studied the structure again. "It's very clean, sir. No debris field, no visible fuel staining on the concrete, no signs of recent activity." "Exactly. If they abandoned it during their retreat, where are the burn marks? Where's the equipment damage? The Germans don't clean up when they're running for their lives." Their mission had originated 48 hours earlier at T-Force headquarters in Brussels. T-Force, officially 30 Assault Unit, was a specialized intelligence-gathering organization tasked with capturing enemy technology, documents, and scientific personnel ahead of regular forces. They'd been created after British intelligence realized the conventional army often destroyed or overlooked valuable technical intelligence during combat operations. The unit's commander, Commander Ian Fleming of Naval Intelligence, had personally briefed Hartley on this operation. Yes, that Ian Fleming, the same man who'd later write spy novels. Fleming had spread reconnaissance photographs across his desk and tapped one particular image with his pipe. "This one's priority, Hartley. Allied air reconnaissance identified it as an active V2 launch facility 3 weeks ago. German retreat patterns suggest they abandoned it sometime in the last 10 days. We need you inside before the Canadians roll through. If there's documentation on guidance systems or fuel composition, it could be invaluable. The Boffins at Cuxhaven are desperate for complete technical specifications." Hartley had studied the aerial photos carefully. The site showed all the characteristics of V2 infrastructure. 3 concrete launch pads arranged in a triangular pattern, connecting service trenches, storage bunkers, a technical building, and what appeared to be a fuel preparation facility. Vehicle tracks suggested recent activity. In one photograph, taken in late February, something that might have been a Mailwagen, the V2 transport vehicle, was visible near the central pad. "What about defenses?" Hartley had asked. "None observed in the last 2 reconnaissance passes. Jerry's pulled back to the Rhine, but watch for booby traps. You know how thorough they can be." Now, as dawn approached on March 23rd, Hartley's team of 14 Commandos lay concealed in the tree line, preparing for their approach. Each man had been hand-picked for his specialized skills. Besides Hartley and Morrison, the team included Sergeant William Bowen, a demolitions expert from the Royal Engineers who'd served in North Africa and could identify German explosive devices by their wiring patterns. Bowen was a careful man who'd survived 3 years of dealing with German mines by being methodical to the point of obsession. Corporal Thomas Peters, another demolitions specialist but also their mechanical expert. Before the war, Peters had worked at a Manchester aircraft factory and could assess industrial equipment at a glance. Corporal Andrew Chambers, formerly an accountant at Lloyd's of London. Chambers had discovered an unexpected talent for identifying fraudulent documents during intelligence work in Italy. If the Germans had left paperwork, Chambers would determine if it was genuine. Private First Class Robert Hayes, their photographer. Hayes carried a modified F-24 aerial camera and had standing orders to document everything. Intelligence analysts back in London could extract information from photographs that field operatives might miss. Private Michael Sullivan, their radio operator. Sullivan had been a telegraph operator in civilian life and could transmit Morse at 30 words per minute even under fire. The remaining 8 men were combat specialists from various commando units, hard men who'd learned their trade in places like Deep, Sicily, and Normandy. They were there to keep the technical specialists alive. As the eastern sky began transitioning from black to deep blue, Hartley gave the hand signal. The team moved forward in 2 groups, using terrain features and the morning mist for concealment. Hartley led the first group toward the main technical building, while Sergeant Bowen took the second toward the storage bunkers. The installation was larger than the aerial photographs had suggested. What appeared from above as a relatively compact facility sprawled across nearly 10 acres. The 3 launch pads were positioned at the points of an equilateral triangle, roughly 60 meters apart. Each pad was surrounded by concrete blast walls standing 4 meters high and half a meter thick. The construction quality was impressive. Poured concrete with minimal visible cracking, despite what should have been months of thermal stress from rocket launches. Hartley's team reached the perimeter of the first launch pad as dawn broke. The light revealed details invisible in the reconnaissance photos. The concrete pad itself measured approximately 12 meters square, with a circular blast deflector in the center designed to redirect the rocket motor's exhaust. Feed lines for fuel and oxidizer ran in protected concrete channels to connection points where the rocket would have stood. Corporal Peters crouched beside the blast deflector, examining it closely. He ran his gloved hand across the concrete surface, then scraped at it with a knife blade. After a moment, he looked up at Hartley with a troubled expression. "Sir, this deflector's never been used." "Explain." "The V2 rocket motor produces about 25 tons of thrust. The exhaust temperature exceeds 2,700 degrees Celsius. That kind of heat leaves distinctive marks, thermal discoloration, surface pitting, carbon deposits. This concrete looks like it was poured recently and never fired." Peters pointed to the surface. "See these marks? They're paint. Someone's painted weathering effects onto new concrete." Hartley felt his stomach tighten. He keyed his radio. "Bowen, what's your status?" Static crackled, then Bowen's voice came through. "At the storage bunker, sir, it's strange. There are fuel drums here, about 20 of them, but they're all full. The Germans don't abandon full fuel drums when they're retreating. Those are valuable. And, sir, these drums are marked as containing ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen, but when I knocked on them, they sound wrong. The resonance is off. Don't open them yet. Stand by." Hartley moved toward the technical building, Morrison and 4 men following. The structure was a low concrete bunker, half buried for protection against air attack. Its steel door hung slightly ajar, not torn from its hinges, not damaged by explosives, just open. No lock. No visible attempt to secure or destroy the contents. The door opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges. Inside, emergency lighting still functioned, powered by a generator they could hear humming somewhere in the complex. The main corridor was wide enough to move equipment, with doors leading to various specialized rooms. Signs in German marked each space. Raketenmontagehalle, Rocket Assembly Hall, Treibstoffvorbereitung, Fuel Preparation, Ladungseinstellung, Guidance Calibration. The layout matched British intelligence reports of genuine V2 facilities. Someone had done their homework. But as they moved through the complex, Hartley's unease intensified. The Rocket Assembly Hall was a large space, perhaps 20 meters long and 10 wide. Assembly jigs stood ready to hold the V2's component sections during integration. Tool racks lined the walls. A overhead crane system could lift the heavy warhead section. Everything appeared functional. But nothing showed signs of actual use. The assembly jigs were pristine, no scratches where heavy components would have scraped against metal during positioning. The tool racks held tools that looked new, their handles free of the oil staining that came from repeated use. The crane cables showed no fraying or wear marks. "This facility has never assembled a rocket," Morrison said quietly. In the guidance calibration room, the evidence became even more obvious. V2 guidance systems were precision instruments, temperamental devices that required careful adjustment. The calibration equipment should have been surrounded by the fine dust that accumulated around sensitive electronics. The workbenches should have shown tool marks, spilled solder, the general entropy of technical work. Instead, everything looked like it had been positioned for a photograph. The fuel preparation area was perhaps most revealing. V2 rockets used a hypergolic propellant combination, ethyl alcohol, A-stoff, and liquid oxygen, B-stoff. These substances left distinctive stains and residues. The alcohol could be smelled days after handling. The liquid oxygen's extreme cold caused frost damage to unsealed concrete. The pumping equipment that transferred these fluids from storage to the rocket bore permanent staining from months of use. Here, the fuel lines were clean. The pumps showed no residue. The concrete floor had no frost damage or chemical staining. "Corporal Chambers," Hartley called, "I need you to examine the documentation." They'd found the operations office on the facility's second floor. Documents were scattered across desks and filing cabinets in apparent disarray, as though the occupants had fled hastily. Launch schedules, fuel consumption reports, maintenance logs, personnel rosters. It was exactly what intelligence analysts hoped to find at a captured V2 site. Too exactly. Chambers began examining the papers systematically. He developed a methodology during intelligence work in Italy. Look first at the physical documents themselves before reading content. Check paper quality, ink consistency, wear patterns. Forged documents often got the content right but missed physical details. After 20 minutes, Chambers looked up. "Sir, these are newly printed. The paper hasn't yellowed, the ink is consistent across documents supposedly created months apart. And look," he held up 2 pages. "These maintenance logs supposedly kept by different technicians use identical handwriting. Someone created all of this recently, probably with a typewriter and a small printing press." "What about the content?" "That's where it gets interesting. The numbers look convincing at first glance, but they're wrong. The fuel consumption logs show 4,000 liters of A-stuff and 5,000 liters of B-stuff per launch. A V2 actually uses approximately 4,000 kilograms of alcohol and 5,000 kilograms of liquid oxygen. Whoever wrote this converted mass to volume without adjusting for density differences. An engineer would never make that mistake." "And look here," he pointed to a launch schedule. 4 launches on February 18th. But this facility only has 3 pads. You can't launch from the same pad twice in one day. The concrete needs time to cool and be inspected." Morrison was photographing documents rapidly. "It's all fake. The whole bloody installation is a decoy." The implications cascaded through Hartley's mind. How many reconnaissance flights had photographed this site? How many photo interpreters had spent hours analyzing these images? How much bombing tonnage might have been allocated to striking this phantom facility? And most importantly, how many real V2 sites had escaped attention because Allied resources were focused on elaborate fakes? "We need to search systematically," Hartley ordered. "If this is a deception operation, there will be evidence of how it was constructed. Germans are thorough. They'll have kept records. Sullivan, get on the radio. Tell headquarters we've found a decoy installation and need a full technical intelligence team here as soon as possible." Over the next 4 hours, as dawn became morning, the picture emerged piece by piece. Private Hayes photographed everything while the others searched. In a maintenance shed disguised as a tool storage area, Corporal Peters found the smoking gun, construction materials that didn't match the apparent age of the structures, fresh paint supplies, weathering compounds designed to make new concrete look old. Most revealing, he discovered wooden mock-ups of V2 transport vehicles, credible enough to fool aerial photography, but clearly never intended to transport actual rockets. "Look at the construction," Peters explained, showing Hartley one of the mock-ups. "It's clever. They built a wooden frame matching the mail origin's dimensions, covered it with painted canvas, and mounted it on actual wheels. From 20,000 feet, it photographs identically to the real thing. But it probably cost 1% of what a genuine mail origin costs. And look, there are attachment points for moving it around the site. They positioned it different places for different reconnaissance flights." Sergeant Bowen made an equally significant discovery in what appeared to be a simple drainage culvert. The concrete pipe was large enough to crawl through, and Bowen, ever suspicious of German engineering, had decided to check if it might conceal explosives. Instead, he found a hidden compartment containing files. "Sir, you need to see this," Bowen called over the radio. Hartley met him at the culvert entrance. Bowen emerged covered in mud, holding a waterproof case. Inside were blueprints, not for a missile facility, but for Scheinenlich V2B, Decoy Installation V2B. The plans were dated November 1944 and included extraordinary detail. Whoever designed this deception had studied Allied photo interpretation techniques carefully. The blueprints noted specific details that photo interpreters looked for: vehicle spacing patterns, fuel drum arrangements, the way dirt became compacted around frequently used equipment. The plan included instructions for creating convincing visual signatures from various altitudes while minimizing actual resource expenditure. There were notes about optimal weathering techniques. New concrete must be aged using diluted acid solution to create surface texture matching 6–8 month exposure. Apply in irregular patterns to simulate natural weathering. Guidelines for equipment placement. Position vehicles at 7–12 meter intervals to suggest operational deployment without geometric precision that indicates staging. Even instructions for managing exhaust signatures. Install smoke generators near launch pads. Activate during known reconnaissance windows to simulate pre-launch fueling operations. Morrison studied the blueprints with professional admiration. This is sophisticated psychological warfare. They've reverse-engineered how we gather intelligence and created a deception that exploits our interpretation methodology. Chambers had found additional documentation in the administrative office, a complete operational manual for Deception Unit 47. The manual outlined the unit's mission: construct convincing V-2 installation replicas to divert Allied reconnaissance and potential bombing resources from genuine launch sites. The economics were chilling. According to the manual, a genuine V-2 launch facility cost approximately 2 million Reichsmarks to construct and required skilled labor, specialized equipment, and months of work. A decoy facility like this cost perhaps 300,000 Reichsmarks and could be built in 6 weeks using mostly unskilled labor and existing materials. But the decoy's intelligence value was enormous. Every reconnaissance flight photographing, it was a flight not photographing real facilities. Every analyst studying these images was an analyst not examining genuine targets. Every planned bombing raid against it was tonnage not dropped on operational sites. The manual included a section on credibility enhancement. Real V-2 facilities occasionally had mechanical failures, launch aborts, and accidents. The decoy sites were designed to simulate these events. The unit would stage small explosions to create burn marks. They'd scatter damaged equipment fragments around the site. They'd even create fake repair activities that could be photographed from the air. They're not just building fake facilities, Morrison observed. They're creating entirely fictitious operational narratives. By midday, they'd cataloged the major elements of the deception. But Corporal Peters found something that changed their understanding entirely. "Sir, there's a bunker system under this complex." They'd noticed ventilation shafts earlier, but assumed they served the nominal storage bunkers. Peters had followed one shaft and discovered it led to a much more extensive underground network, not for rocket operations, but for the construction crews themselves. Hartley descended the concrete stairs into the underground complex. Emergency lighting illuminated a surprisingly spacious area, living quarters for perhaps 30 men, a mess hall with kitchen facilities, workshops containing printing presses, woodworking equipment, and painting supplies. This wasn't a temporary construction site, it was a dedicated facility for producing deception. In one workshop, they found molds for creating concrete components that looked weathered, samples of different paint formulations, each labeled with detailed notes about creating specific visual effects. A photography darkroom where someone had been developing and analyzing their own aerial reconnaissance photos, presumably to verify the deception's effectiveness from the air. The living quarters were most revealing. Personal items suggested the construction crews had lived here for weeks or months. Calendar notes documented construction phases. One calendar showed their work schedule extending into late February 1945, just 3 weeks ago. "They didn't abandon this place," Peters said. "They completed their mission and left." On a desk in what appeared to be the unit commander's quarters, they found a leather-bound log book. The entries were in German, but Morrison's university German was sufficient to translate key passages. The first entry was dated November 12, 1944. Unit arrived at site. Terrain assessment complete. Begin construction phase 1, primary concrete pours and blast wall construction. Local labor conscripted from nearby villages. Cover story, underground fuel storage facility for Wehrmacht retreat operations. Subsequent entries documented steady progress. November 28, primary structures complete. Beginning detail work on launch pads. Applied initial weathering treatments. Result satisfactory but requires additional aging. December 15, First RAF reconnaissance flight photographed site. Photos acquired through agent network. Analysis shows facility reads as partially constructed V2 installation. Added additional equipment staging to enhance operational impression. January 8, 1945. Second reconnaissance flight. Enhanced vehicle positioning protocols. Facility now appears fully operational. Request additional aerial photographs to verify deception effectiveness from various angles. February 3, third reconnaissance flight. Staged launch preparation activities during known overflight window. Smoke generators successfully simulated fueling operations. Anticipate facility will be classified as active launch site by Allied intelligence. The final entry was dated February 27, 1945. Mission complete. All deception elements verified through captured Allied reconnaissance photos. Facility appears authentic from aerial observation. Underground workshop sealed. Equipment relocated to next site, coordinates classified. Unit departing tomorrow. Installation will serve its purpose without further maintenance. Allied bombing or ground reconnaissance will eventually reveal deception, but by then it will have consumed months of enemy intelligence analysis effort. Objective achieved. Hartley read the entry twice. The cold professionalism of it was remarkable. These weren't desperate soldiers creating hasty camouflage. They were specialists executing a deliberate campaign to manipulate Allied intelligence gathering. How many of these installations are there? Morrison wondered aloud. That question haunted Hartley as his team completed their documentation. If the Germans had created one sophisticated decoy, they'd likely created many. The V2 program itself had been under constant Allied surveillance since intelligence first identified the weapon's development at Peenemünde in 1943. Every genuine launch site was photographed, analyzed, and targeted for bombing when possible. But now, how many of those genuine sites were actually elaborate fakes? By mid-afternoon, Sullivan had established solid radio contact with T-Force headquarters. Commander Fleming himself came on the line after Hartley reported their initial findings. "Hartley, this is Fleming. Confirm you found a complete decoy installation." "Affirmative, sir. Complete with underground construction facility and documentation of the deception operation. This was built specifically to fool our reconnaissance." A pause. "Stand by for technical intelligence team. ETA 6 hours. Secure everything and prepare detailed documentation. This could be significant." "Sir, one question. How many V2 sites have we identified in this sector?" Another pause, longer this time. 12 confirmed, another 8 probable. Why? "Sir, if the Germans put this much effort into one decoy, there may be others. The documentation here suggests this was one of multiple installations by a specialized deception unit." "Christ," Fleming's voice was quiet. "Hold position, I'm coming with the technical team." The technical intelligence team arrived at 2100 hours, accompanied by Commander Fleming and a collection of specialists. Photo interpreters from RAF Medmenham, V2 technical experts from the captured Peenemünde facility, and even an American intelligence officer from the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The American, Colonel Richard Harrison, examined the site with particular intensity. "We've been tracking V2 launches by their impact patterns and estimated launch locations. Some of our mathematical models haven't matched observed impacts. We kept getting mismatches between calculated launch points and photographed facilities. This might explain why. We've been including decoys in our calculations." Over the next 3 days, the team conducted exhaustive analysis. They dismantled sections of the facility to understand construction techniques. They examined every document. They interviewed local Dutch civilians who'd observed the construction. One elderly farmer, speaking through a translator, provided useful information. "The Germans brought workers in November. They said they were building fuel storage. The workers lived underground. We could see ventilation shafts. They were very thorough, always measuring and photographing their work. In February, they left. They took their equipment but left the buildings." The photo interpreters from Medmenham made perhaps the most unsettling discovery. They brought comparison images of other suspected V2 sites in the region. Using the characteristics identified at this decoy, they examined each site carefully. "This one," senior photo interpreter Flight Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell pointed to an aerial photograph. "Same construction pattern as the decoy. Look at the weathering on the blast deflectors. It's too uniform. And the vehicle positioning follows the same geometric pattern. This is probably another fake. This one too, and possibly this one. By the time they finished, Mitchell had identified 6 probable decoys among the 12 confirmed V2 sites in the sector. Commander Fleming stood before the assembled team on the evening of March 26th, 3 days after the initial discovery. Ladies and gentlemen, this represents either a catastrophic intelligence failure or a successful counterdeception operation, depending on how we respond. The Germans have successfully deceived us about the scale and location of V2 operations in this entire sector. He paused, letting that sink in. But they also left us a gift. We now understand their deception methodology. We can identify characteristics that distinguish real facilities from fakes, and we have time to correct our intelligence assessments before the war ends. Fleming turned to Hartley. Captain, your team's work here may have prevented significant misallocation of bombing resources. Well done. But the implications extended beyond immediate military operations. The German deception program revealed sophisticated understanding of Allied intelligence gathering methods. Someone in German intelligence had studied how RAF reconnaissance worked, how photo interpreters analyzed images, what details Allied intelligence prioritized. They'd then created a deception system that exploited those procedures. The underground construction facility suggested this wasn't improvised. The Germans had developed institutional expertise in technical deception. They'd created specialized units, developed standardized procedures, and deployed these capabilities across multiple locations. Colonel Harrison summarized the strategic implications. The V2 program itself was Hitler's prestige project, a wonder weapon that was supposed to change the war. By early 1945, it was clear the V2s weren't decisive, but the Germans still had incentive to make us think they were. These decoys served a psychological purpose. They suggested productive capacity the Germans no longer possessed. They implied an arsenal larger than reality. Every fake launch site contributed to the myth of German technological invincibility, even as the Reich collapsed. The technical documentation captured at the site proved invaluable. British intelligence used it to create new photo interpretation guidelines distributed throughout Allied reconnaissance units. Analysts were trained to look for specific telltales. Paint simulated weathering rather than thermal damage, geometric precision in equipment placement, absence of the organic entropy that characterized actual military operations. Within 2 weeks, photo interpreters had reassessed V2 intelligence across the entire European theater. Of approximately 80 suspected V2 facilities identified by Allied intelligence, they determined that perhaps 25 were sophisticated decoys. The real V2 launch sites were concentrated in areas that had received less attention because reconnaissance resources had been dispersed chasing phantoms. The intelligence was shared with American units advancing toward Germany's industrial areas. When U.S. forces captured additional V2 documentation at Nordhausen and other sites, they found references to Scheinenlige programs, deception installations, confirming the systematic nature of the campaign. After the war, Allied investigators tracked down members of the German deception units. Captain Werner Schultz, who'd commanded the construction at the Dutch site Hartley discovered, was interrogated by British intelligence in 1946. Schultz's testimony provided additional context. We knew by late 1944 that we couldn't win the war, but we still had orders to support the V2 program. Building decoy installations was more effective than building additional real ones. A real launch site required specialized engineers, sophisticated equipment, and was vulnerable to bombing. A decoy required basic construction skills and wooden mock-ups, but both consumed Allied reconnaissance resources equally. He described the operational theory. We didn't need the decoys to withstand close inspection indefinitely. We just needed them to look convincing from reconnaissance altitude and consume enemy analysis effort. Each fake site you photographed and studied was time and resources not spent finding real launch sites. The deception paid for itself if it diverted even one bombing mission from a genuine facility. The interrogators pressed him on the ethics of the deception. Schultz shrugged. It was war. The Allies used deception too. Your Operation Fortitude with fake armies before D-Day was brilliant. We were simply using similar principles applied to technical installations rather than combat units. For Captain Hartley, the discovery of the decoy site became a defining moment of his wartime service. He'd participated in numerous special operations, raids, intelligence-gathering missions, even assassination operations against SS officers. But finding that empty concrete installation felt different. It revealed a dimension of warfare he hadn't fully appreciated, the intelligence war where perception mattered as much as reality. In his official report, Hartley wrote, "The sophistication of the German deception operation suggests that future conflicts will involve increasingly complex information warfare. The traditional distinction between frontline combat and rear-area intelligence gathering is breaking down. An enemy's ability to manipulate our perception of their capabilities may become as important as their actual capabilities." The report proved prescient. The Cold War that followed saw extensive development of military deception techniques by all major powers. The principles observed at that Dutch decoy site, understanding opponent intelligence, gathering methods, and creating deceptions that exploited those methods, became doctrine. The site itself was demolished in the early 1950s. Local Dutch authorities, wanting to erase reminders of the occupation, removed all the concrete structures. By 1960, the land had been returned to agriculture. Nothing remained to mark where Hartley's team had discovered the elaborate fake. But photographs of the site, particularly the comparison images showing genuine V2 facilities versus the decoy, appeared in intelligence training manuals for decades. British, American, and later NATO intelligence analysts studied the case as an example of successful technical deception and ultimately successful counter-deception. The lesson proved enduring. In modern warfare, appearances can be as important as reality. An elaborate fake that consumes enemy intelligence resources serves strategic purposes even if eventually exposed. And the most dangerous enemy installations are sometimes the ones that don't exist at all, because they represent not just physical threats, but psychological operations designed to manipulate perception and waste resources. Hartley himself survived the war and returned to academic life, eventually becoming a professor of history at Cambridge. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he maintained correspondence with Morrison, Bowen, and several other team members who'd been with him that March morning in 1945. In a 1978 letter to Morrison, then retired and living in Edinburgh, Hartley reflected on the incident. "I've been thinking about that Dutch site again. What strikes me now, 33 years later, is how mundane the discovery felt at the time. We were simply doing our job, searching an abandoned facility. But we'd stumbled into something larger, a systematic campaign to manipulate Allied intelligence. The Germans didn't just build one fake installation. They created an entire doctrine of technical deception. That felt significant then, and feels even more significant now, watching modern intelligence services grapple with similar challenges of verification and truth in an age of satellites and computers." Morrison replied, "I remember being more angry than impressed. All those reconnaissance flights, all those analysts studying photographs, all that effort wasted on a pile of concrete and painted wood. But you're right, it was sophisticated. They understood that in modern war, making the enemy see what you want them to see is its own form of victory, even if temporary." The decoy site's broader impact on military intelligence practice was substantial. Post-war analysis estimated that German deception operations, including but not limited to V2 installation fakes, had consumed approximately 15–20% of Allied reconnaissance resources in the European theater during 1944–1945. That represented hundreds of thousands of man-hours of photo interpretation, thousands of reconnaissance flights, and considerable bombing tonnage allocated against non-existent targets. But the counter-deception effort that followed Hartley's discovery allowed Allied intelligence to partially recover from this misdirection. By identifying decoy characteristics and reassessing previous intelligence, analysts could refine their understanding of actual German V2 capabilities. This improved targeting in the war's final months, though the impact was limited since Germany surrendered in May 1945. The broader intelligence lessons proved more valuable in the long term. Understanding that adversaries would attempt sophisticated technical deception led to development of better verification methods. Multi-source intelligence collection, technical analysis beyond simple visual observation, and healthy skepticism about convenient discoveries all became standard doctrine. The V2 program itself, both real and simulated, represented the intersection of technological warfare and information warfare. The rockets were genuine military innovations, the first long-range ballistic missiles, predecessors to the space age. But the intelligence battle around them was equally sophisticated. Germany's attempt to manipulate Allied understanding of V-2 capabilities through decoys was matched by Allied efforts to penetrate German security, steal technical information, and ultimately capture both the weapons and the scientists who created them. Commander Fleming's work with T-Force exemplified this intelligence approach. Rather than simply destroying enemy facilities, specialized units like Hartley's were tasked with capturing technology and understanding enemy capabilities. The discovery of systematic deception at the Dutch site enhanced this mission. It revealed not just what the Germans had built, but how they thought about intelligence warfare. In his final report on the incident, Fleming wrote, "The Dutch decoy installation represents sophisticated enemy intelligence operations. More significantly, it demonstrates that technical superiority alone is insufficient. We must also excel at verifying information and resisting deception. The Germans understood our intelligence methods well enough to exploit them systematically. This suggests we must continuously evolve our techniques to avoid predictable patterns that adversaries can manipulate." The report concluded, Captain Hartley's team successfully identified and documented a sophisticated deception operation. Their work prevented misallocation of military resources and provided intelligence value exceeding the original mission objectives. This incident should be studied as a case example of successful counter-deception operations and the importance of verification in technical intelligence gathering. Today, the farmland near that small Dutch village shows no evidence of the elaborate deception that once occupied the site. The concrete is gone, the underground bunkers filled in, the wooden mock-ups long since destroyed. But the photographs remain in archives, and the lessons endure in military intelligence doctrine. The story of British commandos discovering that V-2 site was a decoy illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare. The battle for accurate information is as crucial as the battle of weapons. An enemy's ability to manipulate what you know, or think you know, can be as strategically valuable as their actual military capabilities. And sometimes, the most important discoveries in war aren't the enemy weapons you find, but the elaborate illusions you see through. London, England, October 1985. Captain James Hartley, now Professor Emeritus at Cambridge, stood before a lecture hall filled with military intelligence students. At 72, his hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes, but his mind remained sharp. The invitation from the Ministry of Defense had been unexpected. They wanted him to speak about an operation from 40 years earlier that had remained classified until just last year. In March 1945, Hartley began, my team discovered something that changed how we understood intelligence warfare. We found an abandoned V-2 launch site in the Netherlands, except it wasn't abandoned and it wasn't real. He clicked the projector, and a black and white aerial photograph appeared on the screen, the Dutch decoy site, pristine and convincing from 20,000 feet. The students leaned forward. This was history most had never heard. Over the next hour, Hartley recounted the discovery in detail. He spoke of the painted weathering on unused concrete, the forged documents with their mathematical errors, the underground construction facility where German specialists had lived for months while building an elaborate lie. He described Commander Fleming's reaction, the frantic reassessment of intelligence across the entire theater, the realization that perhaps a quarter of identified V-2 sites were sophisticated fakes. But it was his conclusion that resonated most powerfully. The Germans understood something we're still grappling with today, Hartley said. In modern warfare, perception can matter as much as reality. That decoy installation cost perhaps 300,000 Reichsmarks to build, but it consumed millions of pounds worth of our reconnaissance effort, analyst time, and planned bombing resources. The return on investment was extraordinary, not because it deceived us permanently, but because it wasted our resources even temporarily. He paused, looking across the young faces before him. We live now in an age of satellites and computer analysis. You might think such crude deceptions are obsolete. I would argue the opposite. The principles we encountered in 1945 are more relevant than ever. Your adversaries will study how you gather intelligence and create deceptions that exploit your methods. The technology changes, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you verify truth when your opponent understands your verification process? After the lecture, several students approached with questions. One young RAF intelligence officer asked what had become of the German deception unit commander. Captain Werner Schultz, Hartley replied. We interrogated him in 1946. He was remarkably forthcoming about their methods, saw it as professional courtesy between intelligence officers. Last I heard, he'd become a civil engineer in Hamburg, building actual infrastructure instead of fake military installations. He died in 1979. Did you ever speak with him after the war? Hartley nodded slowly. Once. In 1962, I was at a NATO intelligence conference in Brussels. Someone mentioned my name and a German officer approached me, Schultz's former deputy. He arranged a meeting. Schultz and I had dinner. We spoke for hours about that decoy site, about intelligence methodology, about how the Cold War had made our wartime deception techniques look almost quaint by comparison. What did he say about building the decoy? He said it was the most effective operation of his career. Not because it worked. By definition, successful deception only works until it's discovered. But because it demonstrated a principle, you don't have to deceive your enemy permanently to achieve strategic value. You just have to make them waste resources chasing shadows long enough to matter. The lecture marked one of Hartley's final public appearances. His health was declining, and the travel from Cambridge had exhausted him. But he'd wanted to tell the story one more time to pass the lessons to a new generation of intelligence professionals. Lieutenant David Morrison, his second-in-command from that 1945 mission, had passed away in 1982. Sergeant William Bowen had died in 1977. Corporal Thomas Peters lived in Manchester, still working as a mechanical engineer at age 68. They'd maintained sporadic correspondence over the decades. Their shared experience at that Dutch site a bond that transcended the normal drift of post-war years. In his final letter to Peters, written in November 1985, Hartley reflected on the discovery's lasting significance. We thought we were simply documenting an abandoned facility. We didn't realize we'd stumbled into a systematic campaign to manipulate Allied intelligence. The sophistication of that deception, the understanding of our reconnaissance methods, the attention to detail in creating false narratives, the institutional expertise represented by those underground workshops, all of it suggested that future warfare would increasingly involve battles over information itself. I think we were right. The Cold War has proven that controlling what your adversary knows or believes can be as strategically valuable as controlling territory or resources. The Dutch farmland where the decoy site once stood had long since returned to peaceful agriculture. In 1983, a local historian discovered records of the installation and proposed placing a commemorative marker. The Dutch government declined, preferring not to memorialize a site built by occupation forces. But the historian published a small article in a regional journal, noting that, for a few months in 1945, this quiet corner of Gelderland played an unexpected role in the intelligence war, not as a genuine military installation, but as proof that in modern conflict, even carefully constructed lies can reveal important truths about how adversaries think and operate. The photographs Hartley's team took in March 1945 remained in British intelligence archives, occasionally retrieved for training purposes. The case study appeared in classified intelligence manuals throughout the Cold War. Young analysts learned to look beyond obvious visual evidence, to question convenient discoveries, to understand that sophisticated adversaries would study their methods and craft deceptions accordingly. By the 1980s, satellite reconnaissance had largely replaced aircraft-based photography. Computer analysis augmented human interpretation. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. How do you distinguish genuine military capabilities from elaborate deceptions when your adversary understands your intelligence-gathering methodology? The V2 decoy site became a teaching example precisely because it demonstrated timeless principles. The Germans had reverse-engineered Allied photo interpretation techniques and created installations that would photograph convincingly. Modern adversaries would do the same with satellite imagery, electronic signals intelligence, and whatever other collection methods their opponents employed. Professor James Hartley died in January 1986, 3 months after his Ministry of Defense lecture. His obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime service with T-Force, but included no details. Much of his work remained classified. The full story of the Dutch decoy discovery wouldn't be publicly released until the 1990s, when Cold War-era classification restrictions finally expired. In the end, that March morning in 1945, when a British commando captain stood in an empty concrete facility and realized everything was fake, represented more than a tactical intelligence success. It marked recognition of a fundamental shift in how nations would compete and conflict in the modern age. Wars would still be fought with weapons and soldiers, but increasingly, they would also be fought with information and deception, with carefully constructed illusions designed to manipulate opponent perception and waste their resources. The side that better understood this dimension of conflict, that recognized how to both create and penetrate deception, would hold significant advantage. The empty concrete pads in that Dutch forest had been built to deceive, but in being discovered and analyzed, they taught lessons that proved more valuable than the deception itself. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes not from what your enemy succeeds in hiding, but from understanding how they tried to hide it. That understanding, hard-won through decades of conflict and continuous evolution of intelligence methods, remains the lasting legacy of Captain Hartley's discovery. The specifics of V-2 rockets and aerial reconnaissance are historical curiosities now, but the principle endures. In any conflict, knowing truth from carefully constructed fiction is itself a battlefield, and victory there can be as decisive as victory anywhere else. The shadow cast by that decoy installation stretched far beyond 1945, extending through the Cold War and into the information age. In an era where deepfakes and cyber deception represent new frontiers of strategic manipulation, the lessons from that Dutch site remain eerily relevant. The empty launch pads are gone. The men who built and discovered them have passed. But the fundamental question they posed, how do you verify truth when your adversary masters the art of deception, continues to challenge intelligence professionals in every generation. That question, more than any specific installation or operation, is the true legacy of what British commandos found in the Netherlands on a cold March morning in 1945. Not just a decoy site, but a window into the future of warfare itself.